Hi everyone, welcome to this IES UN Europa seminar. Thank you so much for joining us for our talk today from Professor Tracy-Lynn Field. I have the honour of introducing her. So Professor Tracy-Lynn Field is an enrolled advocate and professor in the Wits School of Law at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. Her research focuses on environmental law, human rights, water law, climate change law, and extractive industry transparency. She has over 20 years of experience and has contributed to both academic research and practical policy, working closely with organisations like the Centre for Environmental Rights and the Wits Centre for Applied Legal Studies. As the author of books including State Governance of Mining, Development and Sustainability, and the co-editor of books including Climate Change Law and Governments in South Africa, Climate Litigation and Justice in Africa, and the Future of Just Transitions, Professor Field has contributed to important dialogue on mining, climate change, development and sustainability. Her massive open online course, Mining for Development, the Taxation Linkage, attracted over 1,000 students from 70 countries, showcasing her commitment to global education on these vital topics. As a former chair of the Centre for Environmental Human Rights Boards and an independent panel member for the South African Human Rights Commission, she has worked on various international initiatives, including with the UN Special Rapporteur on the Environment. Her current focus includes water stewardship law, particularly as she is the Claude Leon Foundation Chair in Earth, Justice and Stewardship. So in today's talk, Professor Field will address just water transitions and applying this issue to the building of private dams. This will explore the role of private entities in water governance and its implications for equitable access to water for all. So let's hand over to Tracy-Lynn Field, if she's there, and I'm very much looking forward to the talk. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I really appreciate that introduction. And thank you for everyone for joining today. I must say, this was the first meeting where I've seen so many note takers, and I'm really intrigued about how you actually create a note taker to attend a meeting. So if somebody will enlighten me and put the information in the chats, I'll be very grateful. So welcome to the people who are here virtually and to the people who are here through note takers. I appreciate that you've made the time to join me today. So I'm going to share my screen, which has the presentation for today, and this will, because I have the introduction as part of that. So let me just do that. Okay. Sarah, are you good? Can you all see my screen?
Fantastic, Tracy-Lynn, go ahead.
Fabulous. Okay, so the work that I'm doing now, Sarah has sort of reeled off a lot of things that I've been involved in. I actually think I've been involved in too many areas of focus, and my resolve for this year is to focus on only one thing, which I've never done in my life, and that thing would be water. And that is really supposed to be the center of my research and my work because of the funding from the Claude Leon Foundation, which funds this chair in Earth Justice and Stewardship. So the interesting thing about that chair is that it is a co-chair with my colleague, Professor Craig Sheridan, who many of you will know. And Craig is a chemical engineer based in the School of Geography, and he and I have worked together on a number of initiatives. And it's been a very rich experience because through him, I've really respected the need for kind of rigorousness in the scientific claims or the claims that one makes in an advocacy context, which are often a little overblown. So being very careful about the sort of scientific basis of what I'm saying. And then also learning that for what I would take as sort of taken for granted knowledge is not necessarily the case, and that it's sometimes good to just flesh that out. Sorry, I'm just going to move this so it's not in the way. So the topic that I'm presenting on today, which is this idea of just water transitions, is based on work that I did for the Public Affairs Research Institute, and that's a kind of like an advocacy research organization over December, and it was a report on key social justice issues in South Africa's water sector, looking at the idea of water and the just transition. The topic of private dams, small unregistered private dams, was not something I was aware of until I did this research. And it was really intriguing to me that what I found about small private dams is not in the policy debate. So I thought this was a good opportunity to kind of bring the sort of theoretical conceptual work on just water transitions and this topic of small unregistered private dams together to kind of refract that issue through this lens of just water transitions. And just to go back, I just want to go back one slide. My title slide. So this is a picture I took a couple of years ago. I think it was post-COVID in an area of our country called Redlinghuis, which is on the Western Cape Coast. And this is a small dam. I strongly believe this was illegally constructed. But yeah, this particular area of our country and the issues that were being faced there about the construction of small dams, which actually caused, which is contributing to one of our Ramsar sites, the Verlorenvlei, running dry. That was something that really piqued my interest. So there's been a kind of streams of just alerting me to this as a topic. The just transition concept is something that one will be familiar from through the energy debate. So it's become prominent in policy debates on this epochal shift from fossil fuel to renewable energy carriers. In this debate on energy, which is, and I will talk about the choice that is inherent in the energy transition. We don't have to move to different energy carriers. We still have a choice, even though we're being driven to it by greenhouse gas emissions. There is a spectrum of ways of understanding the just transition. So the idea is that in the process of, because we're having this technical shift to a different kinds of energy carrier, that it'll be a chance to reshape society, to redefine the nature of economic and political power in a way that conforms with multifaceted understandings of justice. But the scope of that, to whom justice reaches is something that is, there's a sort of narrower and wider definitions, and they kind of sit in the spectrum. So the narrowest definitions of the just transition focus on really providing a social safety net for workers in the coal mining industry. Extending a little bit wider than that is the kind of definition that you'll find in this book that I co-edited with colleagues, Darren McCauley, Raphael Heffron, and Ian Todd, which was a book about the future of just transition, but focused mainly on energy. And that is that, it's a chance not just focusing on workers in the coal mining industry, but looking at disrupting and reconfiguring and replacing the prevailing global carbon-intensive regime. So that's broader. Even broader than that is something that you'll find in the South African Climate Change Act, which was passed in 2024. And that definition of the just transition, and this is taken from the Act, brings in a developmental focus. So speaks to shifting towards low carbon, climate resilient economy and society, ecologically sustainable economies, and then the triad of policy concern in South Africa, which is about decent work, social inclusion, and the eradication of poverty. Even wider than that is something I came across, and I'll refer to the book a bit later, a book by Matthew S. Henry on hydronarratives. And that points us to the possibility of shifting from extractive to regenerative economy. So you have this kind of spectrum of definitions. I prefer the ones that are sort of on the most extreme end, because I think that, I've always been an activist by nature, and that is what inspires me. The second point I want to make is that while the energy transition might be, there's a choice that we don't have to invest in. We can still choose to drill, baby drill. that freshwater transitions, there is no choice. They're already upon us. And many of you in the meeting will know better than I that there are a number of overlapping drivers that are moving us to a situation of greater water scarcity and greater water stress, which will inevitably contribute to social conflicts. And those drivers include climate change, they include demographic change, increased populations, particularly in Africa, where we're looking at a doubling of the population size by 2050. And even in those states where there is a stable or a declining birth rate, as in South Africa, local and regional migration contribute to stress on freshwater resources. Urbanization, expanding urban areas markedly changes natural processes, environmental quality, and natural resource consumption. Ecological degradation. So through intensive urbanization, industrialization, agriculture, and mining, humans are changing the structure and functioning of aquatic and associated systems and affecting their capacity to renew themselves. And then water pollution. So we're changing the biochemical cycles of phosphorus, of nitrogen. We're driving eutrophication, salinization, acidification, sedimentation of our freshwater sources. And above that, we have this arena of new and emerging contaminants, which is further adding to the mix. And then finally, aging infrastructure. That fresh water is not an ecological gift. It is an ecological gift, but given the vagaries of its availability and the kind of stresses we're placing on water quality, it is only really available for domestic and productive use through investments in water infrastructure. And, if you're looking at a country like South Africa, which it is one of the most dammed countries in the world, and I'll say a little bit more about that later, but you've got vast interbasin transfer schemes, irrigation schemes, canals, something like, hundreds and thousands of kilometers of pipelines, pumping infrastructure, and all of that is subject to the laws of entropy and needing repair and renewal. So because of these overlapping drivers, freshwater transitions are upon us. And so the choice is not whether it is happening, it is whether it will be a journey of increased exclusion, marginalization, securitization. And I'm interested that this seminar series is focusing on water security, securitization, inequality, and poverty. So that's our one scenario. Or like the vision of an energy transition, a transition that leads to more resilient, inclusive, and ecologically sustainable economies and societies. And that would be the kind of utopia of a just fresh water transition. So the significance of focusing on the justness is that justice becomes the framing rather than technicization of what the options are, or focusing on water security. In thinking through what a just water transition requires, even though the concept itself may be relatively new, and the two scholars whose works have been most inspiring for me in thinking this through are the work of Matthew S. Henry, and then Hannah Boast's work from University of Edinburgh, her work on water in sort of the Israel-Palestine conflict. So it has received far less focus than the energy transition, that there are existing narratives of inclusion and justice that strive for a more inclusive, greater good that we can turn to in thinking through what this just water transition, what it entails. And that these narrative interventions are essential for the just transition process because they're a way to disrupt existing ideologies, institutions, and processes. And when one starts talking about water and sanitation, you very quickly are shifted to a kind of engineering language. I have a PhD student who's looking at the sanitation obligations of the state sanitation obligation in terms of a human rights framing. And she's kind of looking at it from a systemic perspective, from the point of generation to transport to disposal to treatment. And it was so interesting for me that, she has this chapter where she talks about decoloniality and a gendered perspective. And then we come to the chapter on the systems, and almost immediately it becomes, instead of talking about the various flows of the human body, it becomes about human waste, which is quite it carries a lot of baggage. So we have to be very thoughtful and careful about the language that we use, because they carry with them a lot of existing ideologies and history of institutions and processes. So I'm going to talk about 5 of these narrative foundations for a human right to water, for a just water transition. And the first, many of you will be familiar with that, the human right to water. So this builds on a human rights tradition that stretches back to the 1940s. Interestingly, that the first human rights instruments didn't recognize a right to water. It had to be inferred from other rights, such as the right to life, the right to health and well-being. It became closely associated with Articles 11 and 12 of the International Covenant on Social and Economic and Political Rights. Some international conventions recognized limited instances of the right to water, Convention on Discrimination Against Women, Convention of the Rights of the Child. But only really around the turn of the century do you get a kind of normative development of the human right to water through General Comment 15, which was passed in 2003, and then the UN Resolution 64 of 292, which was finally took that resolution from 10. And then there are a number of constitutional traditions. So according to a report I recently read, about 52 countries of the world recognize a right to water in their constitutions. South Africa is one of those. We have a right of access to sufficient water in Section 27 of our constitution. So what do we get from this narrative tradition? The most widely accepted human rights definition that is crystallized is that people should have access to water that is sufficient, safe, acceptable, physically accessible, affordable, and non-discriminatory. So that gives us part of the puzzle of what a just water transition should entail. The second tradition is, or the second source, narrative source, would be the Sustainable Development Goals. And here, Sustainable Development Goal 6 obviously is speaking to water and sanitation. And again, quite interestingly, the Millennium Development Goals didn't include a specific focus on water and sanitation. This is then taken up in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And the frequently quoted statistic that by 2030, 1.6 billion people wouldn't have access to a safe drinking water source. And so in SDG 6, which I see as the kind of culmination of more than a half-century discourse on sustainable development, it's just the latest manifestation of that. You've got 2 clear focal points. So realizing equitable delivery of water and sanitation services for all, as well as managing water resources and the environment sustainably. So what this adds to a human rights framing is the idea that you cannot achieve access to sufficient water unless you also manage the resource sustainably. So it just integrates that systemic ecological understanding into water access, and it just broadens the scope of what we need to be concerned about. The third source for looking at what a just water transition would entail would be borrowing from the energy justice framing, energy justice concepts that have sort of taken roots over the last decade or so. And these distinguish between different kinds of justice. And, over the course of time, scholars have added to different understandings of justice. So you have the idea of distributional justice, which is about the material allocation of environmental benefits. And here you can also have a debate about whether it's about formal equality, whether it's about ensuring sameness of that allocation, whether it's about equity that takes into account different circumstances. You have the idea of recognition justice, that individuals must be fairly represented, free from political threats in their engagements about water, and that you must correct forms of misrecognition. I'll refer to it a bit later, but if you look at the former homeland areas of South Africa and how the users, female agriculturalists, for example, are misrecognized or rendered invisible in our framework. Procedural justice that There should be equitable procedures that allow all stakeholders to participate in a non-discriminatory way, respecting and incorporating localized knowledges. Restorative justice, which brings the past together with the present, that we should account for harms and obligations that arise from wrongdoing in the past. Ecological justice, bringing in the rights of nature. And then finally, cosmopolitan justice, that there should be, all the principles that apply within a jurisdiction should apply to beyond our borders, that our responsibilities to others do not stop at borders. So this is a rich source of justice concepts that help us to think through what we'd want to see when we are dealing with these water stresses. And then the final one that I think is really important and helps me sort of think deeper about the issue of unregistered private dams in South Africa is the framework of racial capitalism. Now, I'm not assuming that you'll all be familiar with this body of theory. It is something that Matthew S. Henry draws from a lot, and helps him think through what hydro-narratives would help to break ideological framings relating to how water is provided. In short, the most critical insight from this body of theory is that racism and capitalism go hand in hand, that capitalism is not a way out of poverty, and that racism is absolutely essential to capitalism. And we conclude here, not just racism, but also gender discrimination, because capitalism relies on these racialized and gendered distinctions for certain people and natures to be viewed as inferior and expendable. So Henry argues that the felt effects of many contemporary water crises can be traced back to the underlying values and logics of a capitalist system that has always relied on this differentiation. And these are rendered necessarily disposable. And in his book, he kind of foregrounds, he says it rests on two principles. The one is extraction. So large-scale water systems depend on this fundamental logic of extraction, which is taking out without a corresponding reinvestment. And through this, you create sacrifice zones. And if you think about, large dam building projects that have created sacrifice zones, or though that's not the only way in which sacrifice zones can be created. So you have the principle of extractivism, you have the principle of expendability, because the natures and people tend to be in these zones, tend to be defined by blackness and rural poverty. And then I thought that there was a third one that should be added, and that is the principle of spoliation. It's spoiled. The water becomes spoiled. The sacrifice zones also become expendable because they are the site of capitalism's residues and excrements, and they are marked by the lack of access to social goods that capitalism can provide. And if you look at our former homeland territories, which were marked by a massive underinvestment in water and sanitation infrastructure, you can see that. And it's part of what I'd call, and I haven't developed this, but I think it's worthy of, sort of further thought. They are part of a governmentality of subjugation, because if you don't have access to those social goods of clean water and sanitation, it affects your ability to be clean and strong and healthy and productive, which just feeds into a kind of racism narrative. So for me, this is really important. It's really important when we think about just water transitions, and to look back in the past and to see how this took place. So looking at extraction, expendability, and spoliation, and that's the kind of triad for the creation of sacrifice zones. And then lastly, and I won't go into this, it's not just thinking so then what? What after that? What kind of ideologies or ways of thinking or approaches or philosophies can we draw on to redefine a future? And those are just some of them I have was inspired by Matthew S. Henry's work, and others, like Mark Swilling's idea of ukama, but they provide other ways of thinking about how we define the relationships around water. And I'm particularly drawn to this idea of collective continuance, which I think is, that we're kind of evolving and we need to ensure collective continuance rather than security. So that then sort of brings me to my working definition of just water transitions, which is that it is one that respects the full range of human rights, in particular the right of access to water for domestic and productive purposes, and then just drawing in that kind of consensus from the human rights tradition. That it requires a systemic and integrated understanding of the ecological, infrastructural, social, economic, and cultural factors that underlie the production of potable water and sanitation. That it strives towards the ongoing transformation of relationships in line with a multifaceted conception of justice, and that it recognizes that the journey and destination of more equitable and sustainable water relations must constantly work against these deeply unjust path dependencies that have rendered some people and natures necessarily expendable for the sake of water security for some and not for all. So that's where I've come with just water transitions. It was, just for that report. And there's still, I'm sure, much more thought to be put into developing this into some kind of peer-reviewed research. So now I want to look at how that framing and also that then, in doing this work, preparing the report, helped me pay attention to this issue of small private dams in South Africa. So for those of you who don't know the South African context, we are a very sunny country. We have high levels of evapotranspiration. We have very unevenly distributed precipitation, which kind of decreases from west to east. And then we have water resources that are almost 98% developed. This distinguishes us from the rest of Africa, where we don't have such so much development of the water resources, but we really are at, it's sort of very precarious and fragile. In terms of water use, agriculture accounts for 63% of our water use, and that is not agriculture at large, that is irrigated agriculture. So about 23 million hectares of land are used for agricultural purposes. About 18 million of that is rain-fed, and about 5 million hectares are for irrigated use. And this map, which I've taken from the National State of Water Report 2023, shows where the main irrigation areas are. So you can see the Western Cape, here in KwaZulu-Natal, Limpopo, and in Mpumalanga, but a very large percentage here in the Western Cape. So small private dams is something that sits here. I'm not talking about municipal use, which accounts for 27% of water used, or industry and mining, 5%, stream flow reduction use, 3%. I think I'm concerned here. So we're not talking about, it's mainly water for productive use. And, why does this invoke justice concerns? Is because of the 2.5 million people involved in agriculture in South Africa, about half are women, and half of them, and most of those women, depend on rain-fed agriculture. So private dams are going to affect the water that's available for agriculture broadly. They're also going to have an effect on conservation. So that invokes ecological justice. So there's a distributional justice concern, and there is an ecological justice concern at least. So when we're looking at water for beneficial use, which was one of the themes that I covered in this report, most of the debates about transformation and the need for distributive justice, restorative justice, procedural justice tends to focus on the statutory system for allocating water rights. And in that debate, the government has, a number of years ago, coined this acronym, Water Allocation Reform, or WAR for short. And so the narratives of distributive and restorative injustice tend to focus on war and who has the rights. So under our National Water Act, there are a number of entitlements that one can have to water. There are essentially only two rights to water, which are the right to basic needs, which is for the basic water supply of 25 liters per person per day, and then there's a right that the ecological reserve has to water, and then you have 4 entitlements. And those are Schedule 1 uses, which are so-called de minimis uses, which include water that you'd need for your vegetable garden or watering your livestock, but provided it's not used for commercial purposes, provided that the land is not being overgrazed. That is actually a condition as well in Schedule 1. But those are the de minimis uses, and that would be the use that most agriculturalists who are relying on rain-fed agriculture would rely on, or they would rely on the next tier of authorization, which is the general authorization. And that is, water above a certain threshold that is authorized by, it's general authorizations that are issued for particular water uses, and you wouldn't then need a particular water use license. And then the authorizations for large-scale water uses would be what is called existing lawful water use, which essentially codifies 150-year taking of water, which stretches back to the mid 1900s, and those are still largely held by the white population group, and then water use licenses. And the main narrative in this war story is that we have essentially regressed. And this is based on work that was done for the Water Research Commission dating from 2018. In 1994, when we had our democratic transition, something like 95% of water for productive uses was controlled by white people, and that we've now shifted to 98%, because the existing law for water uses are recognized. Trade in water has not been, it's been allowed, and that hasn't been aligned with land reform. There's a whole lot of drivers, but essentially we've regressed. So this is where a lot of the attention and focus is. But in doing this, I really came to think, but where is this water? It's like we deal with this theoretical water that can be allocated. Where is the actual water? So South Africa is one of the most dammed, you can look at it in 2 senses, countries in the world, and 2/3 of our mean annual runoff is in storage. This is based on the notion that we have about 5,550, it's a little bit more than that, registered dams. And there is a provision in our National Water Act at Section 120 that requires dams to be registered if they pose a safety risk. And that is if they have a minimum wall height of 5 meters and they're capable of storing more than 50 megaliters of water. So that is the registration requirement. And on the basis of that, we know that we have about 5,500 dams. In the Department of Water and Sanitation's annual report, there's interesting statistics on whether these dams are large, medium, or small. And you can see that, and this is the ownership. So this would be the Department of Water and Sanitation, municipalities, other state departments, our water boards, mines, and then agriculture. So what is interesting here is that most large dams are controlled by the DWS, small municipalities, medium and small. But then what really stands out is that most small dams, and I tried to look for where I got the information today, and I couldn't find it, but I know I found it somewhere, that small dams are with dam walls between 5 and 12 meters. That the vast majority are owned by agriculture, and that would also be, a sort of white population grouping. The government's position on this, as sort of put forward in their annual report, is that these small dams play a critical role in water security and climate resilience. But going into some of the research, and I'm particularly indebted here to a professor at Rhodes University, Professor Mantell, and her colleague, Dennis Hughes, who've done work on small unregistered dams. So these would be dams having a dam wall lower than 5 meters. And so they in one of their pieces, they looked at databases that could survey and just show where all these other small dams are. And the one that sort of really stood out for me was a database that's maintained by the Department of Agriculture. And this is something that they compiled from that database, that the total surface area of these small, and this would be not small in the sense of registered dams, but small below 5-meter dam wall of 5 meters. The total surface of these area of these dams is 270,000 hectares, which represents a similar surface area to large dams, but having a smaller capacity. And looking at the legend here, and just the areas of the country where per quaternary that you'd have between 751 and 1,020 small dams. So, as opposed to a situation where we're talking about 5,500 dams, that we might be talking about more than 100,000 of these dams. So, why there's other research talking about the intensification of these small private dams. In research that Mantell, Hughes, and Miller did in 2010, they found 376 of these dams at the headwaters of the Breda River, which drained about 55% of the catchment. Their 2023 papers, 55 identifiable dams in the headwater tributaries of the Kucha River. This is in the Eastern Cape, where I come from. And that these largely supported large-scale commercial deciduous fruit cultivation, many of them developed between 1985 and 2004, thus spanning the democratic transition. And this intensely dammed area also lay upstream of the main dam, supplying one of the major dams which supplied the city of Port Elizabeth. And those of you who are from South Africa will know that there's, for a number of years, there's been this kind of day zero crisis in Port Elizabeth. And in that debate, I've never heard anybody sort of talk about private dams. So, just highlighting that this is not really on the policy agenda. And then work by Boardman and Foster, looking at the small dams in the Snewberg, and they found a density of 1 dam per 0.9 square kilometer. There's also a lot of research on the social justice issues associated with these small private dams. So this is also a picture I took in Redlinghuis showing a pump house, that it's indicative of agricultural intensification and pollution. Methatel did research that wanted to look at the relationship between irrigation dams and child mortality, and found a causal link and a number of pathways showing that there was an increase in infant mortality associated with the development of these dams, which are linked to nitrate concentrations, the lack of water for water and sanitation, and then also less time to care because people were going further and further to collect water. Siltation and sedimentation, dam failures. Last year in August, we had 4 dams that breached because of floods and that extensive damage to property and need for humanitarian assistance, and that these small private dams also have a number of ecological impacts that they're associated initially, or Mantell and Hughes point to the fact that they're seen as benign, but their research shows that the density of small dams in a catchment impacts water quality through an increase in total dissolved salts and a significant decrease in the macroinvertebrate index, as well as reduced flows. So there are a number of social justice and ecological justice issues that are also associated with these private dams. So now, and I'm on my sort of two last slides. Sarah, I will be finished by 4:45. So my question is, why is this not more on the policy agenda? And if it is going to be on the policy agenda, how are we going to think it through? And this is where the racial capitalism part of the story really becomes significant. Because if you have to ask yourself, why are there so many small private dams, and what in the legal and policy framework enabled that, facilitated that? You go back to the mid-1800s and the tension in South African law between the Roman Dutch conception of the state as controlling water resources and the English common law, which favored the riparian principle. And, through a interesting set of circumstances, that riparian principle triumphed. There was some case law that it was taken up in the statutes. And so for 150, for a long time, from the late 1900s to the passing of our National Water Act in 1994, even though there was a relaxation of the riparian principle in the 1956 Water Act, that triumphed. The riparian principle triumphed. Part of the common law of riparian owners was that these owners had a right to a reasonable share of the normal flow of water resource. But this wasn't suited to South African conditions, because we have very intermittent rainfall, and then when the rain comes, it's like quite violent, and you have a lot of water. So they were finding that if riparian owners could just have a reasonable share of the normal flow, it provided no incentives for storage. So what they did was they abrogated that common law rule, and that has been in place since, sort of the early 20th century, by distinguishing between the normal flow of water and surplus flow of a water resource. And so that was first, put forward in colonial legislation, and then the 1912 Union Act on Irrigation also recognized surplus water. So your normal flow was subject to the reasonable share, but the surplus flow could be appropriated for storage for whoever had the site and means. And this is the case, I don't know when it was decided, but in there, the judge said the following. Among all the riparian owners on stream, there would be perhaps one who possessed a suitable site and the necessary capital and enterprise for the construction of a storage scheme, but his reasonable share in the floodwater was too small to justify the undertaking. Indeed, a single enterprising owner is enabled in suitable cases to acquire control of the entire surplus water of a public stream, and this is one of the most striking features of the 1912 Act. So you can see in that the confluence of racism, because only landowners could have a share of the water resources, is well known, and people of color weren't entitled to that. And capitalism, the facility of surplus water, which encouraged those with capital to construct the storage and take the water. So this then brings me to the question, what does this mean? What does this all mean for policymaking and governance? Unregistered private dams need to be visible in policy debates and strategy formulation. That the transformation of the entitlement landscape must be grounded in what is physically accessible on the ground. That there are ownership debates that we can have about small private dams. And then, what are the actual physical options? Because many of these dams might have been constructed when the landscape looked very different. There might be settlements downstream. So how do we think this through with a just water transition framing in a way that respects all the different facets of that concept? So, Sarah, that is me, and I think I finished exactly on quarter two. So I'm looking forward to the comments.
Perfect timing, Tracy-Lynn. Thank you so much for that fascinating talk. Feel like raised a lot of really interesting issues. We already have one question in the meeting chat, which I'll read out unless anyone else wants to ask one. So please put your hands up, type them in the chat, whatever you feel comfortable with. So Katerina said, thank you so much, Tracy-Lynn Field, for this inspiring and important presentation. The recognition of Mount Taranaki as a legal person, and put link there, raises interesting questions about the legal and ethical implications of granting rights to nature. Could this model be applied to other natural resources, particularly fresh water bodies? And how might that impact water management decisions and the protection of water rights / a just transition for both humans and environment? Thank you. So sorry, quite a long question there, but it's in the chat. So it's easier to read.
That? Okay. So I was very fortunate to have a master's student, a very good master's student, about 2 years ago, who did her research project on the rights of rivers. And she was looking at various examples from Colombia, from Bangladesh, with a couple of countries. I can't recall immediately. And, the very inspiring ways in which the rights of rivers are recognized, the right to regenerate, for example, the right to flow. I was in a meeting last week. I also sit on the board of the Wildlife and Environmental Society, and listened to one of our foremost activists, incredible woman by the name of Yolande Friedman, who runs the Endangered Wildlife Trust. And I kind of agree with her that I don't think that a rights of nature discourse would be as helpful to South Africa as something like the idea of collective continuance, where it's not a rights framing, that it's not about, it's about a different sort of fundamental principle, not a right. And that fundamental principle for me is replenishment. We need to replenish. So if that and working that through is for me a more generative line of inquiry than trying to advocate for rights of nature. Also because, even if you go back to how the ecological reserve was identified, it wasn't, it was already, there was thought about it in the 1970s in South Africa, that took place at the kind of expense of the people who were in the former homeland areas, and took away from the water that was available for them. So in a South African context, we have to be very careful. I'm not saying that in other contexts that those rights of nature, which are hugely inspiring, are helpful, but that's where I'm at. I would rather look at something that looks at integration and people working in nature, with nature.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a very fair point. Yeah, Katrina's thanks to you as well. Have we got any other questions? Hands up or put them in the chat. Shall I ask one as people are thinking?
I'm waiting for Michael Kidd to ask a question.
Is Michael Kidd got a question?
Yes, I don't know if he's online right now.
Okay. I'll give him a second in case he thinks, comes up with one.
Michael Kidd is one of our foremost water lawyers in South Africa. That's why I'm very pleased he joined us today. Yeah.
Oh yes, he does.
He's got one. He's got one.
Please go ahead.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, Michael, we can hear you.
Yeah, sorry, I haven't got a photograph, but my camera's not working. I don't really have a question. There's a couple of things that I'd like to chat to Tracy about, but they're sort of fairly legal, technical, so I'll do that separately. But I don't have any questions now. Thanks. I enjoyed the presentation.
Thanks, Michael.
Fantastic. Yeah, I don't have such a legal technical background, but the story of the small unregulated dams kind of reminded me of the tragedy of the commons, which we talk about a lot in sustainable development. And so you talked about ways of regulating it and this 1912 Act. Do you think there's any ways of overcoming this? Any route forward?
Yeah, so the 1912 Act was, of course, repealed by the 1956 Water Act. Mm-hmm. And that act was in turn repealed by the 1998 National Water Act, which hasn't been amended in a very, it's still largely in place. It has not been amended much at all in a substantive way. There is currently an amendment bill on the table. And in the course of, from 1994 until about 2014, the philosophy of integrated water resources management was really influenced the drafters, and they were trying to give effect to integrated water resources management. And then from about 2009, 2014, the government realized this is really not working. And so they changed the focus to what is termed developmental water management, which would foreground those who have the least access to assets of resilience. And I'm intentionally avoiding the term vulnerable groupings because I've just been looking at Martha Feynman's vulnerability theory. It's not about, because everybody's vulnerable to a certain extent, but certain people have less access to assets of resilience. And having access to a small private dam is an asset of resilience. And because of the history, the way that the law facilitated storage, and those who had capital could, get the best sites for storage. And you're right, it has become a kind of tragedy of the commons, would then have the greatest resilience. And that is not good for the greater good. It's not good for all sorts of justice. And so, yes, we need to think about how we make it a policy issue, and then what the legislation needs to say, even just to make it visible, because at the moment it's invisible, only dams of a certain capacity. So everyone, and I mentioned this to Yolan last week, and she completely agreed that these dams are a complete disaster ecologically. So I was encouraged by that. But yeah, I'm sort of treading my way carefully in case I. It's really
there's lots
interesting.
of very controversial topics that I think you tackle really well. Daisy's got a question. Would you like me to read it, Daisy?
Yes, I can see.
Yep.
But maybe for everyone in the group.
Oh, hi, Daisy.
Yeah, hi. Yes. You maybe already mentioned in the talk. I probably missed it. Is small private dam issue is a common issue globally, or is more common and intense in South Africa?
Today, I wouldn't be able to talk comparatively. All I can draw on is the work of Barbara Schreiner in South Africa, whose work I hugely, and Barbara van Koppen and Barbara Schreiner, and their work on water resource development in Africa. And they make the point that South Africa is quite distinguishable from the rest of Africa. And there's far less room to maneuver because 98% of our water resources are developed. So we are one of the most dammed countries. But that is a debate that's just talking about registered dams. If you now take these unregistered dams into account, it's far worse. And another of Mantell's papers was talking about a project that was recently, sort of in the last, I can't remember when it started, maybe 10 years ago. It was a project to map national ecosystem freshwater priority areas, which would be areas of the country that you needed to ensure a flow of fresh water to protect ecological systems. And in that paper, they make the point that because of the spatial resolution, many of these small private dams were not considered at all. And they're not considered in environmental impact assessments. So they kind of fall beneath the radar. But if you look at the cumulative impact, they would actually stop a number of these freshwater ecosystem priority rivers from flowing.
Yeah, I can see that if it's a lot of them, could be a stronger impact.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I don't know, Graham. I don't know, Margaret. Sorry. Interesting though. I mean, if you're interested, we could go and visit the Verlorenvlei. I'd love to do that on the Western Cape near Redlinghuis. I think that would be a nice case study. When you're in South Africa, maybe we can chat about it.
Yeah, I'm shocked that you said that it's not a bigger issue in South Africa if it's having these ecological and social impacts as you discussed. Has there been extensive research into the ecological impacts, or is it just, you mentioned that one study? I just wondered if there's a lot of other ongoing research.
I have mainly found, and I've written her name down, but I can't see where I wrote it down. Professor Mantell at Rhodes University, I foresee as the kind of leading scholar on this. And then there are a couple of other papers, but nothing as it seems to be under researched.
Yeah,
but there is a
unusual.
basis. It's not like, sorry, this is my cat. It's a completely blank slate.
No, thank you. Yeah, it's very interesting. Have we got any time for one more question? I think if anyone's got one. I think otherwise then we'll finish up a few minutes early, but that's been fantastic. Look forward to continuing the discussion in South Africa. And the next presentation I could quickly mention in this seminar series is Lena Helinska, who's going to be talking next Tuesday at the same time about testing the waters, the interactions between law and science in international disputes concerning watercourses. So I think this follows on, that talk will follow on really nicely from this. So we're looking forward to seeing most of you then. But thank you again, Tracy-Lynn. It's fantastic.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And if any of you want to contact me just to discuss just water transitions, you have my email. I'd love to start the conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks.